The afternoon of July 23rd, 1944, outside the village of Saint-Lô in Normandy, Staff Sergeant Robert Earley of the 2nd Armoured Division stood beside a knocked-out German tank and tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The Panzer IV sat motionless in a hedgerow, its engine compartment still smoking from the hit that had killed it. Earley's crew had just fought their way through 2 miles of bocage country, the dense network of ancient hedgerows that turned every field in Normandy into a natural fortress. They had knocked out this panzer with their new 76mm gun from roughly 800 yards. The German tank had been reversing into cover when the American shell struck its frontal armour and punched clean through. Earley walked around the tank slowly, examining the entry hole. It was remarkably clean, a round puncture slightly larger than 3 inches in diameter, where the armour-piercing round had gone through the front plate. He could see daylight through the hole from the other side of the tank. The armour itself appeared to be about 2 inches thick at the point of impact, maybe slightly less. His gunner, Corporal James Mitchell, climbed up onto the Panzer's hull and peered inside through the commander's hatch. "Sarge, you need to see this," Mitchell called down. Earley climbed up beside him. The interior of the German tank was a catastrophe. The 76mm round had penetrated the frontal armour, crossed the fighting compartment, killed at least 2 crew members based on the evidence inside, and continued through the engine compartment before exiting through the rear plate. The round had gone completely through the tank, entering the front and leaving through the back as if the armour had been sheet metal. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Earley had been fighting in a Sherman tank since North Africa. He had been at Kasserine Pass in February 1943 when American armour met German armour for the first time and discovered how badly outmatched they were. He had fought through Sicily and into Italy. He had seen what happened when a 75mm Sherman engaged a Panzer IV at medium range. It was usually a toss-up, dependent on who saw whom first, who got the first shot, and whether that first shot penetrated. The Sherman's 75mm gun could penetrate the Panzer IV's armour, but it required good angles, reasonable range, and some luck. Now, standing on top of this destroyed German tank with a hole through its front plate that his entire fist could fit through, Earley was trying to reconcile what he had been told about the new 76mm gun with what he was actually seeing. The penetration was total. The armour that had protected this Panzer IV from most of the weapons it might face on the Eastern Front, or in Italy, had offered essentially no resistance to the American 76mm armour-piercing round. This should have been a moment of triumph. American tank crews had been begging for a bigger gun since North Africa. They had watched German tanks shrug off hits that should have been kills. They had lost friends to Panthers and Tigers whose armour the 75mm gun could barely scratch. The 76mm gun was supposed to be the answer, the weapon that would level the battlefield and give American tankers a fighting chance. But as Earley stood there looking at the hole in the Panzer IV's armour, he felt something other than triumph. He felt a creeping sense of unease. The 76mm gun had gone through this tank's armour like it wasn't even there. It had overpowered the protection so completely that it raised an uncomfortable question. If the 76mm gun could do this to a Panzer IV at 800 yards, what did that say about the tanks they were really worried about? What did it say about the Tigers and Panthers that were appearing in greater numbers every week? And most troubling of all, what did it say about the armour on Earley's own Sherman? The M4 Sherman medium tank that entered production in 1942 was not designed to fight other tanks. This fact, obvious in retrospect, was not always understood by the crews who had to live and fight in them. The Sherman was designed as an exploitation vehicle, meant to break through defensive lines after infantry and artillery had done the heavy work, then race into the enemy rear to disrupt supply lines, capture headquarters, and create chaos. Tank versus tank combat was considered a specialized role for tank destroyers, purpose-built vehicles with powerful guns and minimal armor designed specifically for hunting enemy armor. This doctrinal distinction made perfect sense in staff meetings in Washington and at armor schools in Fort Knox, Kentucky. It made considerably less sense to tankers in North Africa, who found themselves face-to-face with German Panzer IVs, and it made no sense at all when Tigers and Panthers appeared on the battlefield in Tunisia and later in Italy. The Sherman's 75mm M3 gun was derived from a French artillery piece from the First World War. It had been modernized and improved, but its fundamental ballistics remained limited by the original design. The gun fired a 17-pound armor-piercing round at a muzzle velocity of approximately 2,000 feet per second. At 500 yards, under ideal conditions with a 90-degree impact angle, this round could penetrate roughly 3 inches of homogeneous armor plate. Against face-hardened armor or at oblique angles, penetration decreased significantly. The Panzer IV, Germany's most numerous tank throughout the war, had evolved considerably from its original design. Early variants had frontal armor of approximately 1 inch, making them vulnerable to nearly any anti-tank weapon. By 1942, the Panzer IV OSF G variant featured frontal armor of 50mm, just under 2 inches. This was adequate protection against most Allied guns at combat ranges. The later OSF H variant, which began production in 1943, added additional armor plates to the front, bringing total frontal protection to 80mm, slightly over 3 inches, at significant angles from vertical. American tankers in North Africa and Italy learned through bitter experience that the Sherman's 75mm gun could usually penetrate a Panzer IV from the front at ranges under 1,000 yards, assuming a relatively square hit. Side and rear armor was thinner and more vulnerable. The problem was that usually, and assuming, were poor foundations for tactical confidence. Combat reports from Tunisia through Sicily and into Italy documented numerous instances of Sherman crews achieving solid hits on Panzer IVs without penetration, particularly at longer ranges or at angles. Then came the heavier German tanks. The Tiger I, first encountered in Tunisia in December 1942, mounted 100mm of frontal armor, nearly 4 inches of steel plate. The Sherman's 75mm gun could not penetrate this armor from the front at any range. Crews had to maneuver for side shots, or wait for tank destroyers with more powerful guns. The Panther, appearing in Italy in 1943 and in large numbers in Normandy, was even more problematic. Its frontal armor was 80mm thick but sloped at 55 degrees, providing effective protection equivalent to perhaps 5 or 6 inches of vertical armor. The Sherman's 75mm round bounced off Panther frontal armor like a tennis ball. American tankers adapted through tactics. They operated in teams, maneuvering to get side shots while one tank drew the German tank's attention. They relied on overwhelming numbers, accepting that they might lose 3 or 4 Shermans to kill one Tiger, but winning through attrition. They called for air support, artillery, and tank destroyers whenever heavy German armor appeared. These tactics worked, in the sense that American forces continued advancing and German forces continued retreating, but the psychological cost was significant. Tankers knew they were fighting at a material disadvantage. They knew their armor would not protect them from German guns at any range, while German armor could often protect enemy tanks from American guns. The 76mm M1 gun represented the American Ordnance Department's response to the armor crisis. Development began in earnest in 1943, after combat reports from North Africa made clear that the 75mm gun was inadequate against German heavy armor. The new gun used a longer barrel and a larger propellant charge to achieve significantly higher muzzle velocity. The standard armor-piercing round weighed 15 pounds and left the barrel at approximately 2,900 feet per second, nearly 50% faster than the 75mm round. The mathematics of armor penetration favor velocity over mass. Kinetic energy increases with the square of velocity, meaning that a relatively small increase in speed produces a disproportionately large increase in penetrating power. On paper, the 76mm M1 gun could penetrate approximately 4 inches of homogeneous armor plate at 500 yards at a 90-degree impact angle. This was a substantial improvement over the 75mm gun's 3-inch penetration at the same range. The first Shermans, armed with the 76mm gun, arrived in Normandy in July 1944. Tank crews received them with mixed feelings. They wanted better firepower, certainly. They had been asking for better firepower since Tunisia. But the 76mm gun came with compromises. The larger gun required a larger turret, which meant removing the gunner's periscope to make room. The new turret was also slightly taller, making the Sherman's already high profile even more visible. Worst of all, the 76mm gun could not fire the high-explosive shells with the same effectiveness as the 75mm gun, and high-explosive shells were what tank crews used most often against infantry, fortifications, and unarmoured vehicles. Tankers were told the new gun would solve their problems with German armour. Ordnance officers assured them that the 76mm could defeat Panthers and Tigers from the front at reasonable combat ranges. The technical data supported this claim, at least partially. Against a Panther's frontal armour, the 76mm round had a theoretical chance of penetration at ranges under 500 yards, assuming a near-perfect 90-degree impact. Against Tiger's frontal armour, penetration was possible but not reliable at any range. What became clear to experienced crews very quickly was that theoretical chance, and possible but not reliable, meant the 76mm gun had not actually solved the fundamental problem. It was better than the 75mm gun, certainly, but it was not good enough to give American tankers parity with German heavy armour. A Sherman with a 76mm gun still could not safely engage a Panther from the front. It still needed to manoeuvre, to coordinate, to rely on numbers and tactics rather than superior firepower. The engagement outside Saint-Lô in July 1944, where Staff Sergeant Earley's crew destroyed the Panzer IV with a single shot from 800 yards, demonstrated both the promise and the problem of the 76mm gun. Against a Panzer IV, the gun was almost absurdly overpowered. The round went completely through the tank, front, to, or back, with energy to spare. But Panzer IVs were not the tanks that kept American crews awake at night. Panthers and Tigers were the real threat, and against those vehicles, the 76mm gun offered improvement but not solution. The technical specifications told one story. The combat reality told another. American ordnance engineers had performed extensive testing of the 76mm M1 gun at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland throughout 1943 and early 1944. They had fired hundreds of rounds at captured German armour plates mounted at various angles and distances. The test data was comprehensive and, within the controlled environment of a proving ground, accurate. Against 50mm of face-hardened armour plate at 0 degrees obliquity, meaning a perfectly perpendicular hit, the 76mm armour-piercing round achieved penetration at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. At 1,000 yards, penetration essentially guaranteed. At 500 yards, the round would punch through 50mm of armour and continue through with sufficient energy remaining to cause catastrophic damage to anything behind the plate. The engineers calculated that against the Panzer IV OSF, G's frontal armour of 50mm, the 76mm gun had complete overmatch at all combat ranges. The Panzer IV OSF H, with its additional armour plating bringing frontal protection to 80mm, presented a more complex calculation. At 1,000 yards, penetration was probable but not certain, depending on the exact angle of impact and the quality of the armour steel. At 500 yards, penetration was highly likely. At ranges under 300 yards, penetration was virtually guaranteed. These numbers represented a significant improvement over the 75mm gun's performance. Against 80mm of armour, the older gun struggled to achieve penetration even at close range. The 76mm gun could reliably defeat this armour at combat ranges, where tank crews could reasonably expect to engage targets. This should have been exactly what American tankers needed. The problem emerged when crews like Staff Sergeant Earley's began engaging actual German tanks in actual combat conditions. The Panzer IV they destroyed outside Saint-Lô was likely an OSF H variant, identifiable by its configuration and the fact that earlier variants were no longer in frontline service. By July 1944, the frontal armour should have been 80 mm thick. The 76 mm round should have penetrated that armour with some effort, creating a hole and causing damage inside the tank. Instead, the round had gone through as if the armour barely existed. The entry hole was clean, the exit hole even cleaner. There was no evidence of the round struggling to penetrate, no spalling on the interior where armour fragments should have, broken off, no indication that 80 mm of face-hardened steel had presented any meaningful obstacle to the projectile. Early reported this observation to his platoon leader, Lieutenant Thomas Crawford, who reported it up the chain of command. Similar reports began arriving from other units equipped with the 76 mm gun. Panzer IVs were being penetrated at ranges and angles that should have been marginal according to the test data. Rounds were going completely through tanks rather than stopping inside after penetration. The armour seemed thinner or softer than expected. Intelligence officers began investigating. They examined knocked-out Panzer IVs more carefully, measuring armour thickness at multiple points and testing the hardness of the steel. What they discovered was that German armour quality had deteriorated significantly by mid-1944. The face hardening process, which required specific alloys and careful heat treatment, was being rushed or skipped entirely. Some armour plates that should have been face hardened were simply homogeneous steel. Other plates had hardening applied inconsistently, creating weak spots where penetration was easier than it should have been. Germany's industrial situation by the summer of 1944 was approaching crisis. Allied bombing had disrupted production of specialty steels. The loss of alloy sources, particularly nickel and molybdenum from occupied territories, forced German manufacturers to use substitute materials that did not perform as well. Quality control suffered as experienced workers were conscripted for military service and replaced with forced labourers who had neither the training nor the incentive to maintain production standards. The result was that Panzer IV's rolling off assembly lines in 1944 had armour that looked like 80 mm of face-hardened steel, but performed more like 60 or even 50 mm of softer homogeneous armour. American tankers engaging these vehicles with 76 mm guns, the effect was dramatic. Tanks that should have required careful shooting at moderate ranges were being destroyed with casual ease at extended ranges. This discovery should have been encouraging. American guns were performing better than expected against German armour. But to crews like Earley's, the implications were troubling. If the 76 mm gun was overpowered against Panzer IVs, that meant it had been designed and tested against armour quality that no longer existed. The ballistic calculations, the penetration tables, all the technical data that promised the new gun would be effective against Panthers and Tigers. Those calculations assumed German armour would maintain its rated specifications. If German armour quality was degrading on Panzer IVs, it was probably degrading on Panthers and Tigers as well. But even with degraded armour, a Panther's frontal plate was still sloped at 55 degrees, and still nominally 80 mm thick. Even if the actual protection was closer to 60 or 70 mm equivalent, that was still at the outer edge of what the 76 mm gun could reliably penetrate. Tigers with 100 mm of frontal armour, even if the steel was softer than specifications, remained essentially immune to frontal penetration at combat ranges. On August 4, 1944, elements of the 2nd Armoured Division engaged German armour near Mortain during the German counter-offensive aimed at cutting off American forces breaking out from Normandy. Staff Sergeant Earley's platoon, now fully equipped with 76 mm Shermans, was positioned on high ground overlooking the approach routes German forces would have to use. Intelligence had warned that Panthers from the 2nd SS Panzer Division were operating in the area. The engagement began at approximately 0700 hours, when German tanks appeared on the road below the American positions. Early's gunner, Corporal Mitchell, identified the lead vehicle as a Panther through his telescopic sight. The range was roughly 1,200 yards, at the outer edge of effective engagement distance even for the 76mm gun. Lieutenant Crawford ordered the platoon to hold fire until the German tanks closed to within 800 yards, where penetration would be more reliable. The Panthers advanced cautiously, apparently unaware of the American tanks on the high ground. At 800 yards, Crawford gave the order to fire. 5 Shermans fired nearly simultaneously. Early watched through his periscope as Mitchell's round struck the lead Panther on the frontal glacis, the sloped armor plate at the front of the hull. The round sparked brilliantly against the armor and ricocheted upward, tumbling end over end into the air. No penetration. The Panther stopped immediately, its commander recognizing they were under fire. Panther's turret traversed with mechanical precision, much faster than a Sherman's manual traverse. It fired its 75mm gun, not to be confused with the American 75mm, as the German gun was a completely different weapon with much higher velocity. The round struck the Sherman to Early's left, Lieutenant Crawford's tank, punching through the frontal armor and detonating the ammunition inside. The tank exploded, turret lifting off the hull and falling back at an angle. No one got out. Mitchell fired again, this time aiming lower, trying for the driver's vision port or the lower hull where the armor was less sloped. The second round hit near the target point but again failed to penetrate. The Panther's armor, even at 800 yards, was defeating the 76mm armor-piercing rounds. 2 more Shermans fired. One round ricocheted like Mitchell's first shot. The other struck the Panther's gun mantlet, the thick armor surrounding the main gun, and created a bright flash but no visible damage. The German tank fired again, hitting another Sherman in the turret. This round did not penetrate completely but disabled the tank, forcing the crew to bail out under machine gun fire from German infantry following the Panthers. The engagement lasted perhaps 3 minutes. The American platoon, shooting from advantageous positions at stationary targets, achieved multiple hits without a single penetration. The Panthers, engaging uphill at moving targets partially concealed by terrain, destroyed 2 Shermans and disabled a third. The remaining American tanks withdrew behind the ridgeline, breaking contact before the Germans could advance close enough to overrun their positions. Early's after-action report was brief and factual. Engaged 1 Panther at 800 yards. Multiple hits observed. No penetrations achieved. Enemy returned fire with high effectiveness. 1 tank destroyed, 1 disabled. Withdrew to preserve remaining force. Lieutenant Crawford killed in action, along with his crew. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Similar reports arrived from other units throughout August and September of 1944. The 76mm gun was proving effective against Panzer IVs, highly effective in fact. But against Panthers, which were appearing in increasing numbers as German forces retreated toward their border and consolidated their armoured formations, the 76mm gun showed only marginal improvement over the 75mm gun it had replaced. Frontal penetration remained difficult and unreliable at combat ranges beyond 500 yards. The tactical implications were clear to crews fighting in France. The 76mm gun had not changed the fundamental equation of tank combat against German heavy armour. American tanks still needed to maneuver for side shots. They still needed to operate in teams, using multiple vehicles to overwhelm a single German tank. They still needed to call for tank destroyers when Panthers or Tigers appeared. The new gun was better than the old gun, but it was not good enough to provide parity with German armour. What frustrated tankers most was the realization that they had received the right answer to the wrong question. The 76mm gun was optimized to defeat Panzer IVs, tanks with 50 to 80mm of relatively vertical armor. Against these targets, it was devastatingly effective. But by the time the gun entered service in meaningful numbers, Panzer IVs were no longer the primary threat. Panthers and Tigers were the tanks that determined battlefield outcomes, and against these vehicles, the 76mm gun offered improvement but not solution. The development timeline of the 76mm gun revealed a fundamental disconnect between the Ordnance Department and the tankers who would actually use the weapon. Work on the gun began in earnest in 1943, based on combat reports from Tunisia and Sicily that emphasized the need for better anti-armor capability. Ordnance engineers focused on designing a gun that could defeat the most common German tank they expected American forces to encounter, the Panzer IV. This was a reasonable assumption based on intelligence available at the time. The Panther had only recently entered service and existed in relatively small numbers. The Tiger was considered a specialized heavy tank that would be encountered rarely. The Panzer IV, of which Germany had produced thousands, seemed likely to remain the primary opponent for American medium tanks throughout the European campaign. By the time the 76mm gun reached production and deployment in mid-1944, the strategic situation had changed dramatically. Germany had prioritized production of Panthers, building nearly 5,000 by war's end compared to roughly 1,300 Tigers. The Panther was no longer a specialized vehicle, but rather the standard German medium tank, replacing the Panzer IV in frontline units. American tankers were encountering Panthers regularly by August 1944, and the frequency only increased as German forces consolidated during their retreat. The Ordnance Department's response to reports that the 76mm gun struggled against Panthers was to develop an improved ammunition type. The T4 high-velocity armor-piercing round, later standardized as the M93, used a lighter projectile with a harder penetrator core. This round achieved higher velocity and better penetration than the standard M62 armor-piercing round. On paper, it could penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at ranges approaching 800 yards under ideal conditions. The improved ammunition began reaching units in France in October 1944. Crews tested it eagerly, hoping it would provide the edge they needed. The results were mixed. Against Panther frontal armor, the M93 round showed improved performance, but still required favorable angles and relatively close range for reliable penetration. At distances beyond 600 yards, penetration remained uncertain. The psychological effect of knowing your ammunition might penetrate if everything went right was not significantly different from knowing your ammunition probably would not penetrate. Both situations required maneuvering for better shots. Meanwhile, the question that had troubled Staff Sergeant Earley since July remained unanswered. If the 76mm gun was so thoroughly overpowered against Panzer IVs that it would punch completely through the tank, why had the Ordnance Department not developed a more powerful gun? The British were fielding 17-pounder anti-tank guns that could reliably penetrate Panther armor from the front at combat ranges. The gun was large and had significant recoil, but the British had successfully mounted it in their Sherman Firefly variant, creating a tank that could engage Panthers on relatively equal terms. American tankers were aware of the Firefly. They had seen British units using them in Normandy. They had heard from British crews about the 17-pounder's effectiveness. The natural question was why American Shermans were not receiving the same weapon. The answer involved a complex mixture of institutional inertia, doctrinal assumptions, and industrial capacity constraints. The Ordnance Department remained committed to the tank destroyer concept. Heavy anti-tank work was supposed to be handled by M10 and M36 tank destroyers, not by medium tanks. The Sherman's role was infantry support and exploitation, missions for which the 76mm gun was adequate and for which the high explosive capability of the 75mm gun was actually preferable. Mounting a 17-pounder in American Shermans would have required significant turret redesign and disruption of production lines that were operating efficiently. These were rational arguments from an institutional perspective. They made considerably less sense to tankers who found themselves facing Panthers with weapons they knew were marginally effective. The British had solved the problem by accepting compromises in production, efficiency and turret ergonomics to gain firepower. The Americans had chosen to maintain production efficiency and accept firepower limitations. Both approaches had logic behind them, but only one left crews like Early's feeling adequately equipped for the threats they actually faced. By autumn of 1944, the pattern was clear. American tanks could destroy Panzer IVs easily, almost casually. Against Panthers, they struggled. Against Tigers, they were badly overmatched. The 76mm gun had narrowed the capability gap, but not closed it. American forces continued to advance because they had overwhelming numbers, air superiority, artillery support, and better logistics. Individual tank engagements remained disadvantageous, but strategic superiority compensated for tactical weakness. Staff Sergeant Robert Earley's crew fought through France, across the German border, and into the Ardennes forest of Belgium by December 1944. Their Sherman, armed with the 76mm gun that had proven so effective against Panzer IVs and so marginal against Panthers, had survived 5 months of near-constant combat. They had knocked out 8 German tanks, 6 Panzer IVs, and 2 Panthers. The Panzer IVs had been destroyed from ranges of 500 to 1,000 yards with single shots. The Panthers had required multiple hits from multiple tanks, close coordination, and favourable circumstances. One Panther had been destroyed only after it threw a track while manoeuvring, leaving it immobile and vulnerable to side shots. On December 16, 1944, Germany launched Operation Watch on the Rhine, the offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. German armoured formations, including significant numbers of Panthers and the new King Tigers, with even heavier armour, struck through the Ardennes in an attempt to split Allied forces and capture the port of Antwerp. The offensive achieved complete tactical surprise, hitting American positions held by units recovering from earlier fighting or newly arrived divisions with limited combat experience. Early's unit found itself in the path of the German advance. Over 3 days of fighting, his platoon engaged German armour repeatedly under conditions that highlighted every weakness of the 76mm gun. Panthers attacked through morning fog, appearing at close range where their armour remained invulnerable but where their guns could easily penetrate Sherman armour. King Tigers fired from concealed positions at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards, distances where the American guns could not even reach them effectively, let alone penetrate their frontal armour. The platoon lost 4 tanks in the first day. 2 were destroyed by Panthers at ranges under 400 yards after their 76mm rounds failed to penetrate frontal armour. 1 was destroyed by a King Tiger from approximately 1,500 yards. The 4th was knocked out by a Panzerfaust, the German handheld anti-tank weapon, fired by infantry the crew never saw in the dense forest terrain. Early's tank survived largely through luck, being positioned behind cover when the German armour appeared and able to withdraw before being engaged. By December 19th, what remained of the 2nd Armoured Division was withdrawing toward more defensible positions. The German offensive had created a large bulge in American lines, hence the battle's name, and threatened to encircle multiple American divisions. The strategic situation was critical, but Early's concerns were more immediate and tactical. His crew had fired 18 76mm rounds during the 3 days of fighting. They had achieved multiple hits on German tanks without achieving a single penetration. Every hit had either ricocheted off sloped armour or struck at angles that prevented penetration, despite the improved ammunition they were now using. The psychological impact of this experience extended beyond Early's crew to the entire unit. Tankers who had fought since Normandy, who had destroyed numerous Panzer IVs with their 76mm guns, who had been told their weapons were adequate for the threats they would face, now understood with absolute clarity that they were fighting at a fundamental material disadvantage against German heavy armour. The improved gun that had been promised as the solution to their firepower problems had proven to be merely a better version of an inadequate weapon. Combat. Effectiveness studies conducted after the Ardennes offensive revealed patterns that supported the crew's experiences. Shermans, armed with 76mm guns, achieved frontal penetrations on Panthers in approximately 15% of engagements, where they fired first and hit their target. This compared to roughly 8% for Shermans armed with the older 75mm gun. The improvement was measurable but not decisive. Panthers, by comparison, achieved frontal penetrations on Shermans in approximately 85% of engagements where they fired first and hit their target. The disparity was stark. American tactical doctrine adapted to this reality. Tank units were instructed to avoid direct engagements with German heavy armor whenever possible. When engagement was unavoidable, doctrine emphasized the use of multiple tanks attacking from different angles simultaneously, forcing the German tank to expose its thinner side armor to at least one American vehicle. Artillery and air support were to be called immediately upon contact with Panthers or Tigers. Tank destroyers with 90mm guns were given priority for engaging heavy armor, allowing Shermans to focus on infantry support and lighter vehicles. These tactical adaptations worked in the sense that American forces continued to advance and German forces continued to lose ground. But the adaptations came with costs, measured in destroyed tanks and killed crews. Early lost 3 friends during the Ardennes fighting, men he had trained with in England before D-Day, men who had survived Normandy and the drive across France. They died in a Sherman equipped with the gun that was supposed to give them a fighting chance against German armor. The bitter irony that haunted Early through the winter of 1944 and into 1945 was the memory of that destroyed Panzer IV outside Saint-Lô in July. The 76mm round had gone completely through that tank as if its armor were paper. The penetration had been so complete, so effortless, that it seemed to prove the new gun was everything the Ordnance Department had promised. But that easy victory had been misleading. The gun was devastating against an opponent that was no longer the primary threat. Against the opponents that mattered, the Panthers and Tigers that determined the outcomes of tank engagements, the 76mm gun remained marginally effective at best. By January 1945, American forces had stabilized the front lines in the Ardennes and begun pushing German forces back toward their starting positions. The strategic situation was never truly in doubt despite the initial German successes. American industrial capacity, which had produced the Sherman tanks that proved marginally effective against German heavy armor, had also produced everything else needed to win the war. Artillery in quantities that allowed fire missions to be called casually. Aircraft in numbers that provided air superiority so complete that German forces could barely move during daylight hours. Trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, and other vehicles that gave American forces mobility German forces could no longer match. The Sherman tank, with its marginally effective 76mm gun, was part of this overwhelming material superiority. American factories had produced over 49,000 Shermans by war's end. Germany produced approximately 6,000 Panthers and 1,300 Tigers during the entire war. The numerical advantage was nearly 8-to-1 in total tanks, and much higher in certain periods and theatres. Even accounting for German qualitative advantages in armour and firepower, the numbers made the outcome inevitable. Staff Sergeant Earley understood this intellectual calculus. Everyone in the army understood it by 1945. America would win the war through material superiority. But intellectual understanding did not change the tactical reality that his tank's gun could not reliably penetrate the armour of the most dangerous enemy tanks he faced. It did not change the fact that German tanks could penetrate his tank's armour from any angle at any combat range. And it did not bring back the men who had died in tanks that were adequate for winning the war but inadequate for surviving individual engagements. The disconnect between strategic adequacy and tactical inadequacy was not lost on senior American commanders. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, received regular reports about tank performance and crew complaints about firepower limitations. Lieutenant General George Patton, commanding Third Army, was particularly vocal about the need for better tanks. But by late 1944, the logistical and industrial momentum was too great to change. Factories were producing thousands of Shermans per month. Supply lines were established to maintain these tanks in the field. Crews were trained on Sherman operations. Switching to a new tank design would have required months of disruption to production and logistics for a vehicle that might reach the front lines only in the final weeks of the war. The decision was made to continue with existing equipment and compensate through numbers, tactics, and supporting arms. This was a rational strategic choice. The war would be won with Shermans armed with 76mm guns that could easily destroy Panzer IVs but struggled against Panthers. The men who had to fight in these tanks, men like Earley and his crew, understood the strategic logic. They also understood that they were the ones paying the tactical price for that strategy. American tank development did not stop entirely. The M26 Pershing heavy tank, armed with a 90mm gun capable of penetrating Panther armor from the front at reasonable combat ranges, entered production in late 1944. The first Pershings reached Europe in February 1945. 20 arrived by war's end in Europe, a token number compared to the thousands of Shermans in service. The Pershing represented what American tanks could have been if development priorities had been different, if the tank destroyer doctrine had not delayed medium tank gun development, if the need for a heavier gun had been recognized earlier in the war. But these were counterfactual speculations. The actual history was that American tankers fought the war in Shermans, first with 75mm guns that were clearly inadequate against German heavy armor, then with 76mm guns that were less inadequate but still not truly effective. They won through numbers, through coordinated combined arms operations, through air superiority, and through strategic advantages that made individual tactical disadvantages bearable, if not acceptable. The 76mm gun remained in service through the end of the war in Europe in May 1945. Crews continued to engage German armor with weapons they knew had serious limitations. The reports of easy penetrations against Panzer IVs continued, as did reports of difficult engagements against Panthers and Tigers. The fundamental pattern established in Normandy in July 1944 persisted through the final days of the war. American guns were devastating against obsolescent German armor and marginal against current German armor. Strategic superiority compensated for tactical weakness, but the compensation was measured in destroyed American tanks and killed American tankers. Robert Earley survived the war. His Sherman, the same vehicle he had fought in since Normandy, carried him across Germany and into Czechoslovakia by May 1945 when the war in Europe ended. The tank had been hit 7 times by German fire during 11 months of combat. 3 hits had been from Panzerfaust handheld weapons that damaged the tracks and suspension but did not penetrate the hull. 4 hits had been from tank guns, 2 from Panzer IVs and 2 from Panthers. The Panzer IV rounds had penetrated the side armor, causing damage that was repaired at field maintenance facilities. The Panther rounds had struck at oblique angles and failed to penetrate, creating large dents in the armor plate but not entering the crew compartment. Earley attributed his survival primarily to luck, secondarily to crew skill, and only distantly to the superiority of his equipment. The 76mm gun had allowed him to destroy enemy tanks, certainly, but it had not given him confidence in engagements against German heavy armor. He had learned to avoid situations where his tank would face Panthers or Tigers directly. He had learned to maneuver for side shots, to coordinate with other tanks, to call for air support or tank destroyers whenever possible. These were effective tactics, but they were the tactics of someone fighting with inadequate equipment, who must compensate through skill and caution. After the war, the US Army conducted extensive studies of tank performance in the European theatre. The studies confirmed what tankers like Earley had experienced directly. The 76mm gun was highly effective against Panzer IVs, achieving penetration in over 90% of frontal hits at ranges under 1,000 yards. Against Panthers, effectiveness dropped to roughly 15 to 20% of frontal hits at similar ranges, and only at ranges under 600 yards. Against Tigers, Frontal penetration was statistically unlikely at any range where the Sherman could reasonably expect to hit the target. These studies also examined German perspective through captured documents and interrogations of German tank crews. The German assessment of American armor was dismissive. Panthers and Tigers could engage Shermans at ranges and angles where the American tanks had essentially no chance of penetrating German armor, while German guns could reliably penetrate Sherman armor under almost any circumstances. German tankers respected American numbers, coordination, and air support. They did not respect American tank design or firepower. One captured German tank commander, when shown a Sherman armed with a 76mm gun after the war, examined it carefully, and then stated through a translator that this was an improvement over the 75mm version, but remained inadequate. His assessment was clinical and professional, not boastful. The Sherman, with a 76mm gun, could threaten his Panther if it achieved a side shot or if he made tactical errors. It could not threaten him frontally at combat ranges if he maintained proper positioning and awareness. This assessment aligned precisely with what American crews had learned through combat experience. The legacy of the 76mm gun in American tank development was complicated. The gun represented the Ordnance Department's attempt to address a real capability gap. It provided measurable improvement over the 75mm gun, but it also represented an institutional failure to anticipate how the tank threat would evolve. By the time the 76mm gun entered service, it was optimized for a threat, the Panzer IV, that was already being superseded by heavier German armor. Post-war American tank development reflected these lessons. The M26 Pershing, which had arrived too late to impact the war significantly, was recognized as the minimum acceptable standard for future American tanks. Its 90mm gun could engage enemy heavy armor on relatively equal terms. Later American tanks, the M46, M47, and M48, all mounted 90mm guns or larger as standard equipment. The era of American tanks armed with guns adequate only for light enemy armor ended with the Sherman and the 76mm gun. For veterans like Earley, the memory of that destroyed Panzer IV outside St. Lo remained vivid decades after the war. The 76mm round had gone completely through the German tank, front to back, with such ease that it seemed to prove American firepower was adequate. But that single engagement, impressive as it appeared at the time, had been misleading. It had demonstrated the gun's effectiveness against obsolescent armor rather than its effectiveness against current threats. The moment of apparent triumph in July 1944 had set up months of tactical frustration, as crews discovered their improved weapon remained fundamentally inadequate against the opponents that mattered. The broader lesson extended beyond tank design to American military doctrine. Strategic superiority can compensate for tactical weakness, but the compensation has costs measured in lives and destroyed equipment. Overwhelming industrial production, absolute air superiority, excellent logistics, and coordinated combined arms. Operations allowed American forces to win the war despite fielding tanks that were individually outmatched by their German opponents. This strategic approach was effective and ultimately decisive. But it left the men who had to fight at the tactical level, men like Earley and thousands of other tankers, feeling that they had been asked to win a war with equipment their own leadership knew was inadequate. The story of the 76mm gun and the Sherman tank is ultimately a story about the mathematics of warfare. Numbers matter, production capacity matters, logistics matter, and strategic vision matters. These factors allowed the United States to win World War II decisively. But mathematics also governs individual tank engagements, where armor, thickness, gun penetration, and hit probability determine survival. At that level, the numbers were less favorable. American tankers understood both sets of mathematics. They knew America would win the war. They also knew their chances of surviving any given engagement with a Panther or Tiger were poor. Living with that knowledge required a particular kind of courage that deserves recognition alongside the strategic brilliance that made ultimate victory possible. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.